Now, the first thing to understand is that the New Testament doesn't come to us in a vacuum, all right? It doesn't drop down from the sky, contextless, nothing all was going on in the world, and just so happened people begin to write stuff. Even if you say, oh, it's about Jesus, all right? And we very recently were the visitor to EGC, and I was looking around for a Bible to give him, and I saw that there was a stack of New Testaments, and I gave out the New Testament. But I wonder whether, I mean, and we do that, right? I mean, we do that, and maybe we read the New Testament, and we are touched by the personality of Jesus Christ and what he did for us, and all of that, and all that, all that's great. But of course, the New Testament is built on the Old Testament. I would argue that you cannot get too much. You can get a lot still from the New Testament writing itself, because part of it is designed that way. But a large part of it, of course, is designed as a continuation of the Old Testament, and not just the Old Testament, but what was going on leading up to the New Testament story. Does that make sense? So there is a historical context that we want to talk about, the historical setting for the New Testament. So because we've already done the Old Testament, so I'm just gonna start with the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon and not go before that. Before that, they had a country. So Israel was a country, they had a country. And that country came to be destroyed in 587 or 586 BC, when Jerusalem fell to Babylon and they ended up in exile. And about 50 years later or so, some Jews returned to Jerusalem because the Babylonians collapsed and the Persians came in. So and the Persians' model is to send the peoples back into their own homelands, and they sent the Jews back to Jerusalem. And about a couple of decades later, they rebuilt the temple, thus beginning what is called the Second Temple Judaism period. All right, the Second Temple Judaism period. So the first Temple Judaism is the Judaism of King David, King Solomon, and the kings, and so on and so forth. But now there is this what we call Second Temple Judaism, that is represented by the temple that was rebuilt, okay, by Zerubbabel, by that generation, Ezra, Nehemiah. We can read all about that. So basically, they were under the Persian Empire, and the Persian Empire generally treated them quite well. But in a couple of a century and a half later, Alexander the Great conquered Israel. So Alexander the Great conquered the land of Israel, and also, of course, the whole of the Persian Empire collapsed. And so now we are in the Greek Empire period. We're under what is known as the Hellenistic rule. Hellenistic rule means Greek rule, right? Greek rule. We're under Greek rule. And Alexander the Great died young, okay? And he didn't leave successors. He didn't leave a successor. And so his empire was broken up into four sections to four different generals that he had. So the first one general took the east part, which is in the yellow. The other one took Egypt, which is in blue, and some took the Turkey side, Ephesus, Thracia, and then another general took Macedonia, which is the homeland, the Greece homeland. And of course, the Roman Empire was also at that time on the rise, all right, towards the west. So there are two particular generals or two broken up empires that is most relevant to us. One is the yellow, the other one is the blue. Basically, between the yellow part, all right, and the Egyptian part, because Israel is in the middle of these two empires. Does that make sense? Okay. So and you can read the book of Daniel where they talk about the king of the north and the king of the south. The king of the north refers to the yellow part. The king of the south refers to the blue part, all right? So the blue part, that's where Pharaoh, which is now no longer the old Pharaoh of Egyptian blood, but now Pharaoh of Greek blood, really. Okay, we call this the Ptolemaic Empire. His Ptolemy, right? Ptolemy the Pharaoh. And to the north, it is the headquarters. Here will be, of course, there's a lot of things going on here, but Antioch would be where um, the base is. So it's Antioch versus Ptolemy, the Antiochians versus Ptolemy, fighting each other. And in order to fight each other, they had to pass through the land of Israel. So depending who is stronger, 50 years of this way, 50 years that way, or something like that. Does that make sense? All right. They just have to make make play the politics to keep themselves alive. And with that, the whole world became Hellenistic. They were, of course, superior in philosophy, superior in mathematics, superior in almost every way. So therefore, the whole ancient world became Hellenized. Greek became the lingua franca of the whole ancient Mediterranean world. And that also, of course, impacted the land of Israel. And so many of the um, Jewish people also became Hellenized, right? Just as many of Asians also became Westernized. But of course, there is a difference between the SJKC people and then the SK people, right? Those who go to government school, right? Okay, and or let's have called English schools and then versus Chinese schools. So although both are the same of the same stock, but then there was going to be a marked cultural difference even within the people group. So that these tensions going on, should we uh, how much of Greek we cannot totally don't do any Greek influence, all right? But how much Greek influence to take on because that Greek influence also include Greek religions, right? The gods and the philosophy that is anti-Torah, that is more pro the Greek gods. So um, what happened was that the battle between the two uh, empires, the Greek Egyptian, and the Greek Antioch, resulted in 167, Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes sacked Jerusalem, desecrated the temple, and outlawed Judaism. So they tried to force them to conform. All right. Um, Antiochus the fourth came back from a humiliating defeat. He was trying to invade Egypt, but he was stopped by Rome. Without a fight, he turned back because he was fearful of the wrath of Rome. And in turning back, it was so humiliating. He needed a victory somehow. So he unleashed it on the Jews on the way back to Antioch. All right. And some of the measures he some of the measures he took was to outlaw Judaism, ban the Torah, outlaw circumcision, okay, and desecrated the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar of God and rededicated the temple of God to Zeus and brought in temple prostitution into the so basically the whole religion was desecrated and anyone who holds on to Judaism will be persecuted. And if you found that you circumcise your child, they will hang the baby around the mother and push both of them off the cliff. Right. So it was just a brutal time for the faithful Israelite. You can read all about it in Daniel 10, 11, 12, okay, 10 and 11 especially. And you can also read some of the intertestamental period works such as First Maccabees, Second Maccabees to get a bit of historical context of the era. So that resulted almost an immediate revolt. Okay, almost an immediate revolt by this family called the Maccabees. So the Maccabees, they led a revolt in order to get rid of the Greeks, and they were successful. They fought for a long time, 20 over years of guerrilla warfare, so that in 142 they gotten autonomy, and they named their new rule, the Maccabees. They named their rule as the Hasmonean rule, right? the Hasmonean. So now we got a Hasmonean dynasty. And in 129, they achieved full independence. Okay. Uh, and so what happened was that uh, they started off in Jerusalem. Okay, the Maccabees got rid of the Greeks in Jerusalem in this area, and then they slowly expand under Jonathan, uh, one of the Maccabee brothers, okay, into a greater Judea area, and then further expansion by Simon, more to the Samaria, up to Galilee as well, and then all the way, and eventually they expanded to both the Cisjordan side and the Transjordan side of the land, right? Very, very impressive, but took a while for them to expand and to roll back some of these Greek rule over the land. So now, of course, if you think about the time of Jesus, we said that we need to have a now that it's no longer the Greeks but the Romans. And so obviously they will look back to this era, okay, as to the model as to how we're going to get independence from Rome. And if the Hasmoneans can do it, then if the Maccabees can do it, then the Messiah will do greater works. You know what I mean? So they have always had that hope. All right. So Hasmonean autonomy, 129, but very quickly, just a couple of generations of Maccabean rule, the Jerusalem was captured by the Romans. Okay, the Romans came and took it over from the Greeks. So the Greeks, of course, by this time, their influence have waned. And so now it's basically between the Romans and the Parthians, right? The Romans versus the Parthians. So the Parthians supported the Hasmoneans, but then the Romans supported someone else. They supported Herod. They supported Herod. So the Romans supported Herod, and the Parthians supported the Hasmonean kings. The Hasmonean kings lost. So the last of the Hasmonean kings, King Antigonus, was expelled, and Herod was then named the king of the Jews by the Roman Senate. So Herod the Great, right? The Herod that you find in the Matthew chapter 1, Matthew chapter 1 and 2, that Herod, he was not one of the Hasmonean kings. He was a usurper. All right. He was a usurper who was backed by the Romans. The Hasmonean kings were backed by the Parthians. The Parthians lost the war. And so the Romans gained control and they installed their puppet king, Herod. And so, well, not entirely puppet. He was Roman friendly then, right? Rome friendly king, Herod. So Herod the Great, Romans captured Jerusalem from the Parthian-backed Hasmonean king Antigonus. So the Hasmonean kingdom was gone, and Herod greatly expanded the temple in order to win favor from the Jews, because he himself was not technically a Jew. Although he was the king of the Jews, but he was an Edomian, an Edomite actually. He was an Edomite instead of a Jew. So he met a lot of resistance. So what he did was that he tried to Judaize himself, to show himself to be a faithful Jew. He expanded the temple. He patronized a lot of Jewish things, and he's called Herod the Great because he's a great builder. He's a great builder. Sometime around the time of Christ, as we read in the Gospels, Herod died, right? And he was succeeded by his sons, Herod Archelaus, Herod Antipas, Herod Philip II. So Herod now becomes a term for king of Israel, right? King Israel kings, they're all now called Herods. Just as, because it's becoming popular, just as Caesar, right? Caesar is actually Julius Caesar, right? And Julius Caesar, but then everyone else now after him is called Caesar. So everyone after Herod the Great is called Herod. So therefore, when you read in the New Testament, you see Herod, you need to know which Herod we're talking about, right? They're not all the same Herods. There are at least 3 Herods in the New Testament that you read about, or 4, depending on. Sometimes they're called Herod, sometimes they're not. So back to this so after Herod, so the Herod the Great's kingdom was more or less the kingdom that the Hasmoneans had. All right. Once he died, his kingdom was divided into several places. So Herod Archelaus gets Samaria and Judea, and then Herod Antipas gets Galilee and Perea. So basically, literally, Judea, Samaria, Judea, Idumea, Judea and Galilee had different governments. They were under different kings, right? It's actually a different country altogether by the time of Jesus. Okay, at the time of Christ, that means after Herod the Great died, uh, Galilee was ruled by Herod Antipas, and then on the south here was ruled by Herod Archelaus, and then there's Philip the Tetrarch. You may have heard of him as well. Philip the Tetrarch was uh, he's here in the east here. Now, so the lion's share, really, the lion's share, including Jerusalem, went to Herod Archelaus. And you can see that Herod Archelaus, 6 AD, until 6 AD, so not a very long reign because he was a terrible king. He was a terrible king. Okay. So even Caesar thought he was a terrible king. Um, and this was, and so what happened was that after Herod Archelaus was promised by Caesar that if you do well, I'll give the whole thing back to you. Now it's broken up into a few pieces between your few brothers. But if you do well, I will give it all back to you. But he didn't. So this part was ruled directly by Rome because Archelaus was such a bad ruler. There was just uprising everywhere. And so in order to quell the rebellion, in order to calm the people down, Rome decided to rule over it directly through prefects. So that's why you get Pontius Pilate, right? The reason why Pontius Pilate was the governor, was a prefect, right, is because the Herods lost his place. So when you see King Herod at the crucifixion, right, at the Passion of the Christ, we have Pontius Pilate, right, and we have Herod Antipas of Galilee, and because Jesus was a citizen of Galilee, right, so therefore Pontius Pilate thought that this should be under Herod's jurisdiction. Does that make sense? Because he's a citizen of Galilee. So, but they've all come down to Jerusalem for Passover feast. So both Herod Antipas, Pontius Pilate himself was based in Caesarea, and both of them came down to Jerusalem for the Passover feast, and that's where Jesus was as well. So all these historical stuff are also quite important lah. All right, cool. So that is the historical setting. So the historical setting is basically they have been under various empires, and they have about 100 years period of autonomy. Now, although Herod became king, right, and they eventually lost it, even that to the Romans, but the Hasmonean aristocracy remained. Right, the aristocracy remained. Herod himself was not able to establish his own aristocracy, not as quickly, because the Hasmonean aristocracy was still landowners, was still controlling a lot of things. And more than that, the Hasmonean aristocracy were also the priests. The priests. Because the power of the Maccabean revolt is religion, right? The Jewish religion, Judaism, was their rise to power, was a claim to power. And so when they kicked out the Greeks and they rededicated the temple, that's called the Hanukkah. We have that in the Gospel of John, the Feast of Rededication. And when they rededicated the temple, they installed the Hasmonean king as priest king. He is the high priest. So the official title of the Hasmonean king was actually high priest. The official title of the Hasmonean kings, right, the Maccabee kings, was actually high priest. So he was the high priest. Then his relatives, right, were all then priests. So basically, because the old priesthood is like gone with the you know what I mean? Because the old priesthood that was established via the Zadokite, Joshua, of all that, all that came to a halt when Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple. So now I rededicated the temple. I'm the one in charge. So he installed himself as high priest and reinstituted temple sacrifices. So so they became the Sadducees. So the Sadducees were basically the Hasmonean aristocrats. Cool. So that is why they were very powerful. Herod, when he comes in, he replaced the king, but he didn't replace the temple power structure. So therefore, he always had to negotiate with the high priest and the Sadducee priesthood. Even Pilate needed to do that, right? Because that is a power base of of the Jewish people. So that brings me to the religious setting of the first century Judaism, of the Second Temple Judaism, right? The religious setting. So the core Jewish beliefs are monotheism, covenant, and Torah. Monotheism would set them apart from all the rest of the world. You see, the rest of the world could easily um, um, assimilate into Greek culture because the Greeks, they have their gods, right? The Romans also have their gods, and other people have their gods, and everybody have, for example, the god of thunder. Everybody, for example, have the god of harvest. Everybody has the god of the sun and moon and whatever not. And so, god of war, god of love, right? So you just need to do a one-to-one match, right? So you have Iris, then you have Mars, right? So they are the same god, right? You have this god, you have that god, is the same god. So that's how they do it. So that is how they kind of unify culture by also unifying their religions to become some kind of a equivalency type of religion. So they could get everybody done except the Jewish people. Because the Jewish people were strict monotheists. Okay, Yahweh is the God of heaven and earth. And Antiochus Epiphanes tried, right, to just force his way through, but that didn't work. That didn't work. In fact, that just resulted in rebellion. And so the Romans like, okay, we need to adopt a different approach with them. We give them we give them a legal status. So Judaism became a legal religion within the Roman Empire. So if you worship the God of Israel, then you are exempted from worshiping the gods anywhere in the empire. So uh, it's called it's become a religio licita, right? It become a legal religion. So that sets them apart. And second thing is that covenant. They believe that Israel has a special relationship with God, and Israel has a role to bring the light of God to the whole world, right? So they see that as their vocation. And also the foundation documents will be the Torah, the five books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. What about the rest of the books? We'll talk about them in just a little bit. So these are core Jewish beliefs that's common to every strand of Judaism. And there's a temple in Jerusalem, the temple that was greatly expanded by Herod the Great. So if you see this reconstruction of the first century temple, it is very grand, it is very big. We are looking from the east. So east is here, west is the other end. All right. So we're looking. This view is from the Mount of Olives. All right. You will see this view, and so this temple complex is for sacrifices. It is where the court meets, right? So the rulings of the courts that is done in the temple, chaired by the high priest, is the religion, community life, festival. So basically, it is, you can say that it is all of Putrajaya and the Parliament building and the Istana all rolled into one. Okay, all rolled into one through in KLCC. So basically, this thing is the center of all Judaism, which means those who are in control of this place will have a lot of influence over the country. So these are the Levites and the priests, the high priest, the Sanhedrin, the high priest and the priests in general. They were basically mostly, unless you are Levite, you are mostly Hasmonean aristocrat, rich people, upper class elites. They're the upper class elites. But most people don't worship in the temple, right? Because to go to temple, you have to be in Jerusalem. So Jesus spent most of his time in Galilee, up north, right? So he doesn't travel. He only travel to the temple maybe once a year. Who knows? But so how do they practice their religion when they are not at the temple? So they have this system called synagogues. Synagogues established as a result of the exile. So a typical synagogue worship will start with a recitation of the Shema. Uh, Shema is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength," right? And so they will recite the Shema. And then after the Shema, they'll have prayers. And then they will have readings. They'll read, so the reading of the day, maybe right now. So Jesus, when he went back to Nazareth, okay, and he opened up the scroll of Isaiah. So that is the reading. Okay. And the person doing the reading also have the right to give um an interpretation. Now, the interpretation, if there is a qualified rabbi, the qualified rabbi can give his interpretation. If there isn't a qualified rabbi, they will read from something called the Targum. The Targum is an Aramaic um, uh, paraphrase, an Aramaic paraphrase interpretation of 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 the reading of the readings is in Hebrew, and then now they'll read the Aramaic Targum. So you can think of it like uh, not a translation, like a Eugene Peterson, the message, right? So Eugene Peterson's the message. So there's just as much Eugene Peterson in it as the Bible is in it. It is Eugene Peterson's own um, paraphrase of the Bible. Correct. So it's also very, very useful. So there's a Targum, there's the Aramaic Targum, because the most people at the time, the mother tongue was Aramaic, not Hebrew. Okay. Hebrew is the official language, but then the the local language that people actually speak is Aramaic. And then after the reading from the Targum, there can be a sermon. If there's a qualified rabbi. So you can remember one episode of Paul's travel with Apollos, whereby they reached this particular synagogue, and clearly they were wearing something that marked them out as Pharisees, okay, and Levite, because Barnabas was a Levite and Paul was a Pharisee, so probably they wore some identifying markers, some habit, all right, that they wore. And so they came as visitors, they sit there. And then the ruler of the synagogue, basically the elder, the ruler of the synagogue is the guy who pay the bills, who make sure that things are maintained and things like that, right? And who runs the service. He then sent people to invite them to speak. So it's after the reading, then invite them to speak because they're qualified to deliver a sermon, right? And then followed by a benediction. So that's how a synagogue service works. And the temple is led by the priests, but the synagogues are led by the scribes. Priests are hereditary. Your father is a priest, so your son is a priest, or your grandson is a priest, and so on and so forth. But scribes are by merit. by merit. They're the teachers of the law. They are the rabbis. Okay, and they're really down to earth people in a sense. Right. So there are factions in Judaism, in the first century Judaism. The, the first faction are the Herodians. The Herodians are the pro-Roman supporters of Herod, based in Galilee and Perea. Why? Because Herod Archelaus no more. So all of Herod's power is now in the north side. Remember? Let me get back to the map. By the time of Jesus, Herod Archelaus country is no more. It's directly ruled by Rome, by sending Roman prefects like Pontius Pilate. Okay. So all of Herod's power base right now, Herod family is the Tetrarch, within the Tetrarch area, and also Galilee and Perea. Okay. So this is Gentile land. This is Gentile land. This is something like Gentile land, but half, something like that. But Galilee is clearly Jewish land. So um, uh, whereas the priests have a lot of authority from Jerusalem and anything around Jerusalem. Samaria has their own thing going on. The Samaritans have their own thing going on. So the Pharisees' power base, okay, uh, teachers of the law, the Pharisees' power, or the Herodians themselves as well, is limited to Galilee and Perea. So these are political pro-Roman people who wants to maintain. So they're secularists, basically, in a sense, right? In our today's term, they will be like secularists. And their bitter opponents in this same area would be the Pharisees, because again, the priests are in control of Jerusalem area of Judea. Judea is under the priests. Samaria is under the Samaritans themselves, right? They rule their own. They do their own thing. Uh, Over this side is Gentile land. Okay. So the Pharisees were also really active in Galilee. So Jesus had a lot of run-ins with the Pharisees because we're all in Galilee. Does that make sense? No, 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 no. Gentile land is over here. Jewish. So this is Jewish. Because this is this is a very Jewish land. It's almost the only Jewish land that is ruled by the Herods now. All right. That's ruled by the Herods now. And so there is a struggle for power between the Pharisees and the Herodians up north in Galilee. So when you read in the New Testament, said Gospel of Mark, and you read that the Pharisees and the Herodians conspired together to kill Jesus, that is a big, big statement. These two were bitter rivals. Okay, they were bitter rivals vying for the same votes, really vying for the same power base. Okay, but because now there is DAP, now there's a third party that we need to unite to fight against, right? So you two are supposed to be bitter enemies because the um because the Herodians, they want to be pro-Romans, the Pharisees are anti-Roman. So the Pharisees and the Herodians came to Jesus a second time around at the temple to talk about should we pay taxes? Because the Herodians say we should pay tax to Rome. The Pharisees know we cannot pay tax to Rome. Right? So the Herodians are these pro-Roman, pro-Roman, foreigners. All right, they say that yeah, be pro-Roman lah. They are so much better than us, and they bring us technology, they bring us civilization, they bring us progress, they bring us economic benefit. Right? They bring us all this good stuff. And you can talk about religion doesn't pay the bill. Okay, religion doesn't improve the economy. Religion doesn't build the country. Who has built our country? Herod. How did he build the country with Roman funding? Without the Roman peace, we'll be fighting wars everywhere, right? So these are the Herodians. The Sadducees are the remnants of the Hasmonean aristocratic priesthood that is based out of the temple. And so they don't believe um, anything after Deuteronomy. So the entire thing is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Joshua onwards, they don't take that as the word of God. Okay, whereas the Pharisees would take all of that. Okay, and the Pharisees have a strict adherence to both the written law and their own oral law. The oral law is to fence in the Torah. If the Torah says thou shalt not kill, all right, then maybe my oral law will include things that don't bring weapons when you go out. All right. If you bring weapons, who knows, you may accidentally kill people. Right. So they try to fence in the the laws. And so they're very popular among the masses because they bring the Torah to everyday life. We may not understand it because we find it legalistic. But for people and for the majority of this country, for example, they really want their religious leaders to give them exactly how to live. You know, what can eat, what cannot eat, what can do, what cannot do. Is this okay? Is that not okay? Is this kosher? Is that not kosher? Is this kosher? Is that not kosher? You know what I mean? So they needed this kind of guidelines for the ordinary folks. So ordinary folks don't want to hear you talk about this high theology. They will just want, they already believe in all of that. They just want you to give them a way to live. So the Pharisees did that. Yeah. Yeah. You can. Not all Pharisees are scribes. Yeah, because a scribe is somebody whose professional job is to copy scripture. So not all Pharisees do that job. Yeah. Yes. The Pharisees are like the successors of Ezra. They have always been about the law, about the law, about the law. Now, during the Hasmonean revolt, okay, they supported the revolt because the promise is revitalization of religion. The promise is to bring back Judaism, to cleanse the temple. They are all for that. Yeah. So although they installed themselves as the high priest, the Hasmoneans, uh, the Pharisees tolerated that. They didn't like the idea, but they say, hey, at least, we got back Judaism. We can practice our religion again. Sure, the temple is corrupt. The temple is not under the Hasmonean authority, the Sadducees. Never mind. We go into the outskirts. We go into the towns. All right. We enter into the synagogues. We teach the people. Yeah. So the Pharisees, the political power of the Pharisees come from the support of the people, of the masses. Yes. No, no. To be a Pharisee, you need to join a school. Okay. You need to study under some rabbi. So the rabbi will start a school. Okay. And then you come to apply, such as Paul. He went to, he became a student, right? And so that's how he became a Pharisee. By merit. Yeah. Also can. Yeah. 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 Some of them. The Hasmoneans, they are. That's the problem because they are not. That's why it's a corruption actually. Yeah. Mm. Corrupted. Already not the same. Already corrupted. Yeah. Already corrupted. Yeah. They don't believe in resurrection. Yeah. Because they read Genesis to Deuteronomy, they don't see any resurrection. Okay. Then we come one interesting group called the Essenes. Now the Essenes, no, for us the Pharisees are like very narrow, right? The Pharisees, they are like very strict and everything, right? To the Essenes, the Pharisees are compromisers. They think of the Pharisees as liberals. This is really far right, guys. This is extreme right wing people. So, um, yeah. These people will consider Donald Trump liberal. You know what I mean? Okay. So, so as a not so they're opposed to the entire Hasmonean priest king, and they withdrew from the temple altogether. They say that this whole thing is now corrupt because the high priest must come from the Zadokite line. You may or may not be a Levite, but you must come from the Zadokite line. Zadok. Yeah, you must be a descendant of Zadok to be high priest. Right? Aaron, down, all right, to Zadok, the high priest, David's time, all right, and then all the way down to Joshua after the exile. So you must come from that line. If you don't come from that line, you're actually, technically speaking, not supposed to be high priest. But the Pharisees were saying, you know what? Yeah, we agree. But the thing is that, what was the temple before this? The temple before this was a Zeus temple, right? The Hasmoneans got us back our country and allow us to practice our religion again. Fine. The temple, they're in control. We go to the towns. We go to the villages. We go to the synagogues. Right? So the Pharisees went to the synagogues. And then for the Essenes, they were totally upset about this whole thing and said, this whole thing is I don't care whether you are Greek, you are Hasmonean, okay, you are whatever, all the kingdoms of the world are garbage. So we withdrew from the whole thing. We have a rigorous keeping of the Torah and a strict code of conduct, and they went into the caves, right, into the desert. So some people would say that maybe John the Baptist was an Essene, right? Who withdrew. He was a Levite who literally withdrew from the temple and preached a different narrative of how to have forgiveness of sins. Forgiveness of sins, whole Old Testament only got one way, right? Go to a temple and offer sacrifice. Now he said, no, baptize in the river Jordan can for the forgiveness of sin. Okay? So that is totally a different message that possibly he got it from the Essenes. And maybe Jesus was also an Essene, but that is all speculation. But John the Baptist is, to me, it seems quite a lot of data points that point him towards an Essene. And they're the one who possibly kept the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls that we have today, all right, probably was kept by them. And we do read some of their other documents that's how we know how extreme they were in purity. And so they believe that they're going to go out to the wilderness, right? Because make straight his path in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, right? Go to the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. So they believe that they are going to be they are the true Israel. When the Messiah shows up, right? When the Messiah shows up, the Messiah is going to lead these Essenians, right? We'll meet the Essenians at the in the wilderness, and together they will march to Jerusalem to reclaim the temple. Okay, so you kind of see that they all have similar goals, which is anti-Rome. Okay, Herodians pro-Rome. Sadducees kind of like, what do you want, right? You want us to be anti-Rome? We were anti-Rome. We were backed by the Parthians. We lost the war against the Romans. Okay, so we are the establishment politicians. So we know how to model how to manage the Romans, right? So you can see the high priest always try to manage the Romans, okay? And they try to play the game because they too are politicians, right? So they say, hey, be rational. What do you want? Do you want our whole country to go to flames? So they are quite rational. They are quite realpolitik. The reality is that you can't go against the Romans. All right, let's just preserve what we have, that kind of a thing. So, but as the Pharisees, no, the Messiah is going to come. When the Messiah come, we're going to kick out the Romans, and that's what I've been teaching in all the synagogues, right? That's why when the Jews come from all over the country to Jerusalem, they come from all the synagogues that have been radicalized by the Pharisees. Okay, and so every time Passover, whatever, is all very scary because anytime can revolution. You know what I mean? All right. But the Pharisees said the reason why the Messiah hasn't come yet is because we are not following the law. All right. If all of us would just follow the law exactly, all right, then all Israel will do that, then the Messiah will come, right? They're quite post-millennial in that sense. then the Messiah will come. As the Essenes say that this whole thing is corrupt, even the Pharisees that have turned liberal, that have betrayed us, both of us fought against, but then now when both of us fought against the Greeks, but when the Hasmoneans installed themselves as high priests, all right, you went along with it. The Pharisees went along with it, right? So no, we are the pure ones, all right. They went out to start the cult in in the desert, like that. And then there are the zealots. The zealots, so one of the disciples was a zealot. A zealot was basically to them they are freedom fighters. To the Romans, they're terrorists. Okay, so they are social bandits, anti-Roman messianism, freedom fighters. So when you read, for example, Jesus gave the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? And there was this man going the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and then was overcome by bandits hiding in the hills, right? These guys lah, oh, 山贼, huh? these guys, bandits. Well, because they're outlaws. They're outlaws. So they have to survive by becoming gangsters of today, Malaysian Chinese gangsters are descended from Tin Tai Wei, right? Fan Xing Fuk Ming, right? Anti Qing dynasty want to restore the Ming dynasty, kind of a thing, right? So gangsters, these guys. Very funny story. One of them was a zealot, the other was a tax collector, both became disciples of Jesus. Wow, the dynamics. One works for the Roman government, one wants to overthrow the Roman government by force. And the two robbers that were crucified next to Jesus, they were zealots. Right? Because if you're just a robber, okay, or even a murderer, you don't get crucified. Crucifixion only happens when you're anti-Roman, when you try to overthrow the Roman order, then you get crucified. Okay. So people who say, oh, you don't need to you don't need to know a lot of things in order to be saved. Look at that guy who was crucified next to Jesus. All he said was, Lord, remember me, okay, when you come in your kingdom. Dude, he knows more than you. He's a zealot, right? He knows the Bible more than you. And for this guy who is thinking to overthrow the Romans, now crucified next to Jesus, both of them dying, and still say, when you come in your kingdom, you are the real Messiah. You are the one that I've been looking for. When you come in the kingdom, remember me. That is faith that is based on a lot of knowledge. Huh? Knowledge. Yeah, we always think of we only need simple faith. We don't need to know a lot of things. You just be like the guy who was crucified next to Jesus. All he made was this simple confession of faith. No, that is a monumental confession of faith for a zealot. All right. So these are the factions. And I will take a break, I'll talk about the literature of Second Temple Judaism. Of course, there's the Hebrew scriptures, the law, the prophets, the writings that Jesus talked about. Okay. The law, the prophets, and the Psalms. If you cannot remember that verse in Luke 24, after I did 11 sessions of New Old Testament, I don't know what to tell you. All right, I have it on every session. Okay, so and there are other literature. One of it was the Septuagint. The Septuagint was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, because they were living in the language of the day was Greek. Although it's a Roman Empire, but still the language of the day was Greek. Okay, so you can think of Latin is the official empire language, but then everyday business is actually done in Greek. So most of the Jews are not living. I don't know whether most, but a lot of the Jews were not living inside Judea. They were living outside, right? They were living in Egypt. They were living in Asia Minor. Paul was from Tarsus. So over time, they will have lost the ability to speak the Hebrew tongue, right? And so therefore, if the reading is in Hebrew and then the Targum is in Aramaic, then dialogue how to have synagogue meetings, right? So they needed to translate it into Greek. And so in Alexandria, in Egypt, there's a group of Jewish scholars who then translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek called the Septuagint, and the Septuagint was treated as authoritative by the Jews. Okay, at least those outside of uh of Judea and Galilee. And we also have the Dead Sea Scrolls that we have. We discovered it in 1946. So between 1946 to 1956, we excavated and we unrolled a lot of these Dead Sea Scrolls to read what's inside. And many of these documents turned out to be biblical literature that predates the time of Christ by a couple of hundred years. So this is like really the earliest Bible that we have in our hands, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls by the Qumran community, probably the Essenes, right? And then we also can learn a lot about Second Temple era by reading Josephus. Josephus was a first century Pharisee, and he participated in the Jewish War of Independence against the Romans, 66 to 70. He lost, all right? I mean, the Jews lost. And so there was a myth. I'm not sure if it's myth or it's real, but there is an anecdote, a story about how he survived that war. They were all supposed to commit suicide because before the Romans come in, but because committing suicide is against the law, all right. So therefore, they had this mathematical thing whereby you kill me, then someone kill you, then someone kill you, then the last guy has to sacrifice and commit suicide, right? So uh, Josephus calculated his way to how to not not die. Right? And he made the mathematical calculation. It's a famous mathematical problem, right? That he calculated. And then when there's left two guys, right, he convinced the guy to surrender. He convinced the guy to surrender to the Romans. And after they surrendered to the Romans, he became a historian and to explain to the wider world the uniqueness of the Jewish nation, why we rebelled, why we fought the war, and why you cannot just impose stuff on us, right? It will never work. You just need to let us be us. So he's trying to explain to the wider Roman Empire, to the world, about Judaism. And so he wrote about Jewish war, about that war period, that war itself. He wrote about the antiquities of the Jews. So the antiquities of the Jews very, very valuable in getting a first century Pharisees understanding of the Bible. A first century Pharisees understanding of Israel's history. Right? He almost had a commentary on every part of the Bible that he wrote. And then Life of Josephus against Atheon. All right. Another important source is Philo. Philo was a Jewish philosopher, but he's a Greek type of Jewish philosopher. He was based in Alexandria. He spoke Greek. So what he did was that he used Plato philosophy, and he took the Jewish Torah and he married the two. He he married the two. So he's basically you may say that's very strange, isn't it? Well, no. Today we would like to use science to interpret scripture and use scripture to interpret science because our culture today is science, right? That's our education today is science based. And so we use science to interpret scripture, we use scripture to interpret science. Uh, whether which one is valid, which is invalid is a different thing, right? But that is what many Christians do. So back in the day, the science of the day was Plato philosophy. So he tries to use Plato philosophy to explain scripture and try to use scriptural revelation to say that it is actually so he brought the two worlds together. And some would say that such a thing influenced the book of Hebrews, for example, or John chapter 1. In the beginning was the word was with God, the word was God, right? So this kind of thing seems to have some influences from Philo, according to some. All right. But nonetheless, the Greek-speaking world, Jews in the Greek-speaking world, such as Paul himself was a Greek-speaking Jew, although he himself could speak Hebrew, but he's from Tarsus. So he would have heard of Philo and his teaching, because this is like decades before Jesus, or rather during Jesus' time, first century, really. And then we have the Apocrypha. Apocrypha is those dozen books or so that you can find in the Catholic Bible. So there's the Old Testament, then the New Testament, then in the Catholic Bible in the between, there is this Apocrypha, Maccabees, you got, all right, Bell and the Dragon. So 151st Psalm. So all this is actually written during that period, the intertestamental period. We call it intertestamental period, or broadly speaking, it's just Second Temple Judaism literature that was not treated as scripture by the Jews, but it's still important writing of culture. And then they have got all these pseudepigrapha, meaning books that are written under assumed names. So the Book of Enoch, for example, supposedly to be written by Enoch, but it's not. Right? It's written during this period using the assumed name of Enoch. And so there are all these books. What did the Pharisees teach? Because Paul was a Pharisee, Jesus interacted with Pharisees, and Pharisees were the ones that went into the villages, into the masses. So generally, people's theology, the people's theology are Pharisee theology. The basic theology is Pharisee theology. Right? That's why you don't see Jesus interacting much with the temple theology, right? But he interacted more with Pharisee theology because the theology of the Pharisees is the theology of the people. All right. So where do we get that? Now, before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70, right? In the year 70, the temple was destroyed again. So there are several strands of Judaism. The Zealots, they were killed by the Romans. The Essenes were largely alone. They were in the desert, but they were not that influential. The real influences are basically the Sadducees and the Pharisees, right? So the Sadducees, their whole power base is the temple. They have no real influence in the countryside, right? Other than formal power. With the destruction of the temple, the Sadducees also have lost all influences, right? So the Sadducees went extinct. So the only form of Judaism, really, that continued to persist is the ones that were taught by the Pharisees. Because the Pharisees was teaching in the villages. You destroy Jerusalem, lah, right? So the villages, the towns, all have that. And they have these oral laws. For example, Jesus would scold the Pharisees that says that you do a good job in establishing, right, in setting aside God's law to establish your own human law, right? He scolds them. Mark chapter 7 about establishing their own tradition of the elders. So they asked Jesus, why don't your disciples wash your hands before you eat? That is against the teaching of our elders. But that is not found in the Torah. That's not found in the Bible. It is the fence that they have built. So they call that the oral law. The oral law that is passed from generation to generation. Now, after the destruction of the temple, they codified the oral law. So because we can actually lose everything, let us write down our oral law. And so the Mishnah is the codified oral laws. So the Mishnah that we have today, that we read, that I read today, because I'm such a nerd, I have to read Mishnahs, right? I read the Mishnah. A lot of this Mishnah dates back to the time of Jesus. A lot of this Mishnah, codified oral, dates back to the time of Jesus. And some of these Mishnah, Jesus definitely interacted with. Some of these Mishnah, Paul definitely interacted with in the epistles. Okay. But of course, because it is codified later, so tambah lah. So we have to be able to kind of like distill to filter out all the tambah to get back to the original ones that were in the time of Jesus. The Tosefta is clearly the additions to the Mishnah. All right. We'll say that Tosefta obviously is after the time of Jesus. And then with the Gemara, which is the interpretation of the Mishnah itself. So yes, the Mishnah is the teaching of the rabbis, of the old rabbis, but then what is the interpretation? So they needed the Gemara to do that. And then they need to compile all these things together, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and the Gemara. they need to do compilations. So there are two compilations. One is the Palestinian Talmud, the other one is the Babylonian Talmud, where they compile all this Mishnah, Tosefta, Gemara into a volume. Because the Mishnah, they were just everywhere. So bring them together, versify them, all of that to put the compilation. There are two compilations. There's the Palestinian Talmud and there's the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is to be preferred. It's just better, qualitatively better. Okay, so really most of today's rabbinical Judaism, they study the Talmud. So the rabbinical Judaism today, the rabbinical Judaism of today, their syllabus, the thing that they study the most is this one, the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud consists of all these things. Yeah. So when they say that they are studying the law of Moses, even not necessarily they are referring to Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That is the written law. They mostly study the codified oral laws that interpret the written law. Yeah. Yeah. So the scribes, the scribes, the scribes, the Pharisees, the descendants of the Pharisees that went to Babylon to do this collection, right? Their collection is superior. Yeah. Hey, you be surprised, okay? Because look, the Jews that returned from Babylon, they are more orthodox than the Jews who stayed back in Palestine, right? Ezra, Nehemiah, they all come back from Babylon. They were more orthodox than the ones in Palestine itself. Mm. This of course they did, but or which exile you're talking about? The first exile, the Daniel exile. Yeah, that exile, I have argued at length in the last in the Old Testament that much of what we have was compiled in Babylon. Yeah. But this is hundreds of years later. This is after the destruction of the temple again in AD 70. Now this is we're talking about 5th century, 400. Yeah. So, whoa, if you compare to the first destruction, the first exile is about 1,000 years. Okay, so but still there were a group of Jewish scribes in Babylon. There is one official copy of the scriptures in the temple, according to Josephus. Josephus tells us that there is an official version in temple in Jerusalem, and anyone who wants to have a copy of will come to Jerusalem to make a copy. Yeah. So if you are a this is what the scribes do. So the local scribes in let's just say Capernaum, right? Capernaum, rich enough of a town. They have a rabbi there, and let's just say their Deuteronomy scroll is a bit jaded, right? A bit old. So they want to have a new copy of Deuteronomy. So then they'll send their scribe over to Jerusalem, show the proper accreditation, who was your rabbi, who's your rabbi's rabbi, whatever, trace the lineage, and then you're qualified. So then you're given the scroll of Deuteronomy, you copy. Once you copy, you bring back. But that was destroyed. Yeah. So therefore we rely on all these other copies everywhere that have been copied. Right? You know what I mean? All these synagogues never got destroyed, what? They all have theirs. Right? And so those who remain in Palestine continue to do so. those who then go elsewhere, so say in the Babylon, they brought all of that as well. So basically, in terms of like, they don't have much differences in terms of that because they're all descendants of the rabbis. But the thing is that descendants are talking spiritual descendants, because it's all by merit. Anyone can be a rabbi. So then, when it's time for them to make a compilation of the Mishnahs of the oral tradition, compile that into Talmuds, there are two compilations. All right. There is the compilation that was done in Palestine that was a bit substandard compared to the compilation that was done in Babylon. All right. That's all I have to say about it. Cool. In Hebrew, yes, Hebrew. And then with the Targum that I told you about, was the Aramaic paraphrase of the Hebrew scriptures. Jesus would have been very familiar with the Targum. And then we have the Midrashim, which is the rabbinic commentary on the Hebrew scriptures. For an example of a Midrashim, a Midrash, an example of a Midrash would be Romans chapter 4, when Paul was talking about, was explaining in what state was Abraham justified by faith? Was it in the state of circumcision or was it in the state of uncircumcision? The answer is that it is in the state of uncircumcision. So, therefore, it means that justification has got nothing to do with circumcision. It has nothing to do with the works. It has all to do with faith. So Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him as righteousness, right? So Paul was doing an interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures like a standard midrash. He really used the midrash format. So that's one teaching of a Rabbi Paul, right? Rabbi Shaul, and that follows the format, the general format of how rabbis teach. Okay, the book of Hebrews, for example, is just full of midrashims, full of interpret. Uh. Take, for example, the one that Jesus was doing about hand washing, right? The Bible teaches that if you're a priest, before you go into the tabernacle to minister, you need to wash. You need to wash, right? Um, so that you can offer sacrifices. There is no commandment for everyone to wash, just the priest that is going into the tabernacle to wash. And so what the rabbi said, well, if you want to be faithful, you have to be faithful like a Levite as well. Right? Who knows when you'll be called to go into the temple? So at all times, you should maintain ritual purity. What, you want to have ritual pollution, man? He said, don't need, ma. It's okay. If I'm not going to the temple, I'm not going to the tabernacle, I can be in ritual pollution. I don't have to be in ritual purity. He said, what kind of faithful Jew would like to be in the state of ritual pollution? Of course, you would like to be in the state of ritual purity. So then, well, why wash our hands before we eat? Because, now Israel is no longer Israel of David's time. Now Israel is the Israel of Roman time. The Romans are here, the Gentiles are here, the soldier is there, okay? And then the money get passed around. You go to the market, you buy something, you pay money, you get exchange the money that you receive, may have touched a Gentile hand, the Gentile might have eaten pork. Malaysia, very familiar story, right? May have eaten pork, okay? And then now touch your hand, then you take your hand, then you eat pork. That was the argument. So we wash everything. We wash our hands, we wash the utensils, the couch also we wash before we eat. You can read all of that in Mark chapter 7. How close is that to the Bible? At least 4 or 5 degrees of separation from the Bible. I preached about it and I wrote about this when we talk about Sunday best. Well, it comes from we have to honor God. Honor God. Right? So how do you honor God? You wear your Sunday best, right? And Sunday best is interpreted to wearing a tie. So if you don't wear a tie, you're not honoring God. So you cannot come to church without wearing a tie. So that kind of a reasoning. So that was what the Pharisees were doing. All right. I know it's 10:56. Let's take a 5 minutes break. Just 5 minutes break. We'll come back. We'll look at the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic means of the same view, optic, same optic, synoptic, same optic. So we're talking about three Gospels in particular: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is kind of like a very different kind of gospel. You know what I mean? So Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a similar storyline, more or less, and John is like, wow, really different. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Synoptic Gospels today. Now, but before that, I'll talk about how to read the four Gospels. I did cover this in the interpretation, how to read the Bible, for all it's worth site. You can read the Gospels vertically. Vertically means you read from top to bottom. You read the Gospel of Matthew the whole way through, chapter 1, chapter 2, up to chapter 28. You read the Gospel of Mark 1 to 16, and then you read the Gospel of Luke 1 to 24, right? You read it that way. Or you can read it horizontally. That is, you take all the stories of the baptism of Jesus, right, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right, and read them together in parallel, horizontal. You know what I mean? Right? You can read it vertically whole way through, or you can read it horizontally, or you can read it harmonistically. That is, you try to uh, try to create a unified story out of out of the Gospels. For example, when Jesus rose from the dead, how many women were there? How many angels were there? Was there like one angel, two young men, two, right? That kind of a thing. Which one happened first? Or the sayings of Jesus before he died? All right. Which was the last? Because every gospel said that he said something before he died, right? One said tetelestai, another one said something different. You know what I mean? Into your hand I commend my spirit. So different things that Jesus may have said. So you want to read it harmonistically to kind of like piece together a seamless account. Okay. So one way to think of it then, to visualize it, vertically is to read from top to bottom. All right. And then horizontally is to read from side to side. Okay. And then harmonistically is to read them. Now there is advantages in each of it. You can think, for example, news report. You can read, for example, a news report from Utusan Malaysia, from the Star newspaper, and from Malaysia Kini, right? So covering the same event. Now, one thing to do, of course, is to read this reporter's account from top to bottom, right? You're reading it vertically from top. What this reporter say from top to bottom like that, right? Because this reporter has a story to tell. Well, that is a good strategy to read to understand what this reporter is trying to say, and then what this reporter is trying to say. One time through. Another strategy, of course, is to read across, right? To compare and contrast between what Utusan say, what the Star say, what Malaysia Kini say, right? And understand why they have the differences in the way they cover the same event, right? I remember a long time ago, birthday rally, the um, the Malaysia Kini will write about 100,000, all right. The Star newspaper will write thousands. Utusan Malaysia wrote wrote more than 1,000. Okay, 100,000, thousands, more than 1,000 showed up. Correct also, what? Right? It's really more than 1,000, but I can see that there's an angling there, right? So Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John, they also have the different angles as they. So we want to read it harmonistically. Read it horizontally to get a clear picture of where the biases are, and the biases to highlight the rhetoric that is behind that. Okay, the agenda, and then you have to read it harmonistically to kind of get a flow of event properly, because not everything is done in a in a chronological order, right? So maybe you have to rearrange the material in chronology. So these are the various ways. But today I want to talk about the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem, right? Synoptic means Matthew, Mark, Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These are the synoptic gospels. There is a problem. The problem is this: 90% of John is unique, but more than 90% of Mark appears in either Matthew or Luke. So one of the things when people talk about the similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that, well, of course they're similar. It's the biography of the same guy, of Jesus Christ. You know what I mean? So it's the biography of Jesus. Obviously, they're going to have a lot of similarities. Well, the existence of the Gospel of John shows us that that's not true. Right? It can be radically different way of talking about Jesus. So then, by just saying, because we are talking about the same guy, therefore the materials are more or less the same, does not hold water. So there's still a need to explain why 90% of the Gospel of Mark is in either the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Luke, such that if you remove the Gospel of Mark, you have 90% of the Gospel of Mark still, right? Either in the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Luke. Does that make sense? All right. Now, not only do they have common material, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but there is verbal agreement between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And you say verbal agreement, of course, because they're quoting Jesus. So if I quote Jesus, I'm going to quote him verbatim. You quote verbatim, I quote verbatim, he quote verbatim, it will be the same thing. Right? But bear in mind, Jesus spoke in Aramaic, probably, right? And then what you are writing here is in Greek. Are you saying that you translated Jesus's Aramaic saying to Greek the same way as I translated Jesus Aramaic to Greek, as the same way as he translated Jesus's saying from Aramaic to Greek? That's very suspicious. Now you can also argue, well, they all memorize Jesus' saying in Aramaic in verbatim, but then when they want to propagate it, the teachings of Jesus to outside of Judea, right, outside of Israel, they want to go to Ephesus and tell them the teaching of Jesus. Then to go to Rome to tell them the teaching of Jesus. Then to go to Corinth to tell them the teaching of Jesus. And so they made a unified translation, right? Official translation of the saying of Jesus, and that is why it is all the same everywhere. Well, but the problem is that the verbal agreement is not only in the sayings of Jesus, it is also in the narrative material, the storytelling part. That means not Jesus talking, but the narrator, the author talking, right? The writer introducing the stories. And we have verbal agreement there, word for word. You know what I mean? So much so that if I have 3 students, I have students and I give them assignment, the same question, right? And then 3 students submitted their essay. Siu Hong recently completed her graduate diploma. Was it graduate diploma in Christian ministry? You write a lot of essays, right? So if you and 2 of other students, all right, submitted the essay whereby your essay word for word can be found, 90% of it can be found in either one of their essays, all right, what would the lecturer think? Plagiarism, right? We'll be thinking plagiarism happened. Okay. But if it is all quoting, but if half of you are just quoting scripture, and then all 3 of you use the English Standard Version, let's just say, then we can understand, right? Because you're just quoting the same verse. Then word for word the same in those parts, okay. But in the narrative side, in the part where you are telling the story, not quoting from scripture, not quoting from authors, how can that be the same? Not only do they have verbal agreement, they have agreement in arrangement. Like this story comes first, then this story comes first, then this story comes first, then that story comes first. There's not necessary it to be like that, all right? Even in the arrangement of the story. Furthermore, they also have agreement in parenthetical comments and narrative asides. Parenthetical comments and narrative asides. I'll give you an example. Things that things are like kind of like by the way kind of a thing. If you say that the major narrative blocks, they have word for word because somebody memorized it word for word, I can get it. All right. Yeah. But then the narrative asides, the parenthetical comments. Give, for example, here is Matthew chapter 9, verse 4 to 6. Behold, some people brought to him a paralytic lying on a bed. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, Take heart, my son, your sins are forgiven. Behold, some of the scribes said to themselves, This man is blaspheming. But Jesus, knowing their thoughts, said, Why do you think evil in your hearts? For which is easier to say, Your sins are forgiven, or to say, Rise and walk? We're all very familiar with this story of Jesus healing the paralytic. But that you may know that so this is a saying of Jesus. Jesus is quoting Jesus here. But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Rise, pick up your bed, and go home. So it's actually one continuous saying of Jesus, right? Jesus saying, but that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Rise, pick up your bed, and go home, right? But then the narrator breaks it up into two sentences, right? Connected by he then said to the paralytic. So this he then said to the paralytic breaks up the saying of Jesus, right? As this is called a narrative aside or a parenthetical comment. Because the saying of Jesus should come in one whole block. You know what I mean? So for there to be a parenthetical statement, this is inserted by Matthew. You know what I'm saying? This line, he then said to the paralytic, is inserted by Matthew. Where did he insert it? Between has authority on earth to forgive sins and rise, pick up your bed and go home. Now, Mark chapter 2 verse 10, but that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, I said to you, rise, pick up your bed and go home. And exactly the same point of a saying of Jesus is that narrative aside. Okay, Luke, but that you may know the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sin. He said to the man who was paralyzed, I say to you, rise, pick up your bed and go home. How come so ngam? All three of you have exactly at the same point, with just a little variation to show difference. Okay, exactly the same thing. Sus, very suspicious, very sus. Yep. Hmm. But you can see that you have a bit of more flexibility, right? Which temptation happened first? Was it Jesus was the first one was turn the stone into bread. The second, which is the second, which is the third? The one that was throw yourself off the temple, or is it the one that bow down and worship me? Matthew has it one way, Luke has it the other way, right? So they don't really care that much about chronology, if you think about it. Yeah lah. Yeah, correct. So, but what about the arrangement of parables? Right? That the parable of the sower come first, and then the other parables in exactly the same order. There's no reason for that, right? Parables are like a standalone pericope that should be exchangeable anywhere. So these are compounding. So instead of saying that, so you're a lawyer, you can think of this as a lawyer's brief, whereby we are compounding the evidence, right, all pointing to the same direction. Let me give you one more very interesting one. Agreement in modification of the Septuagint. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are written in Greek. So when they say this is to fulfill something was about from the Old Testament, they're quoting from the Old Testament, right? They throw the whole paragraph in from the Old Testament. And that quotation, most of the time, comes from the Septuagint. They're quoting the Septuagint. You know what I mean? Matthew was quoting the Septuagint, Mark was quoting the Septuagint, Luke was quoting the Septuagint. Does that make sense? Everybody was quoting the Septuagint. Now, they modify the words of Septuagint in the same place. Let me give you an example. I'm so sorry. Because I have to give you the Septuagint. I will translate for you. Let me get the camera to follow me. Follow me, camera. So here is Isaiah 40 verse 3 in the Septuagint. Phone bontos ente eremo. A voice calling out in the wilderness. Hetoim masate ten hodon kurio. Prepare the way of the Lord. Eutheas poete tas tribus to Theu Haemon. Make straight the paths of our God. All right. So what is this from? This is Isaiah 40 verse 3, right? You know it's quoted by John the Baptist, kind of like not quoted by John the Baptist, but the John the Baptist baptism of the John the Baptist, John the Baptist ministry is usually quoted there, right? Make straight his path, prepare the way of the Lord. So I highlighted here of our God. To Theo Haemon, all right? Phone bontos ente eremo, a voice calling out in the wilderness. Hitoi masate ton hodon kurio, prepare the way of the Lord. Eutheas poete tas tribus to Theo Haemon, make straight the path of our God, to Theo Haemon, of our God. Make straight whose path? The path of our God. All right. Here's Matthew. Hutos ka estin ho reface dia Hesayo to prophatu. Okay, this is what is given to through Isaiah the prophet. Legontos saying, Phone bontos ente eremo. A voice calling out in the wilderness. Ito masate ten hodon kurio. Prepare the way of the Lord. Eutheas poete has tribus out to make straight his path. Make straight his path. So you can see here, phone, bontos. Even if you don't know what I'm saying, you can make out that it's what is alphabet by alphabet. All right. Ente, eremo. We're basically quoting Isaiah 40 verse 3 in the Septuagint. Cool? So you just follow exactly what Isaiah 40 verse 3 says until it says, Eutheas poete has tribus to Theo Haemon, to of our God, make straight the paths of our God. You change to Theo Haemon to autu, his. Make straight his path instead of make straight the path of our God. All right. Now, is that an okay modification? Kind of okay. More or less the same thing. All right. Of our God, the paths of our God, or his paths, right? Is exactly the same thing. So, okay, you can make that kind of modification. No problem. The problem is, here's the Gospel of Mark. Kathos graptai and to Isaiah to prophetes, thus as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. A lot of things. Here. Phone bontos ente eremo. A voice calling out in the wilderness. Etomasate ten hodon kurio. Prepare the way of the Lord. Eutheas poete tas tribus autu. Make straight his path. Mark makes the same modification of the Septuagint, changing of our God to his. All right. Luke as well. A voice calling out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his path. So for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to modify Isaiah 40 verse 3 in exactly the same place is super suspicious. Imagine, again, Su Hong, right, writing the assignment, quoting from the ESV, all right, and make a slight modification from the ESV. The modification is so slight is probably unnoticeable on first reading, okay? But then the other two students who 90% of what she wrote is in the assignment, okay? Even when she make that modification, all right, from the ESV, they make the same modification. What is your conclusion? Copy, right? The conclusion is copy. Now, the synoptic problem is not whether did they copy. The answer is yes, manifestly so. All right, they copied each other. All right, that is not even in dispute. The synoptic problem is who copied who. Who copy who, right? Whose one is the original one? Okay, and whose one is the chiplak one? So this is called source criticism. The original idea was Matthew wrote first. It is called Matthean priority. The reason is because St. Augustine said so. St. Augustine said so, therefore the church said so. Said so. St. Augustine says Matthew wrote first, okay, and then Mark did a Reader's Digest of Matthew, and then Luke took both Matthew and Mark and wrote his stuff. Huh? Yeah, clever guy. So because it's Augustine, right? So the church just take his position for 1,000 years. You understand? For more than 1,000 years, the church held this position. That's why Matthew is number one first. Number one, then was Matthew. All right? Okay, you know what I mean? Right. So for the longest time, right, because Mark was seen as a Reader's Digest version of Matthew. So in scholarship, in church preaching, very seldom we focus on the book of Mark. Right? Throughout history is always focused on the book of Matthew. And then, but because Luke comes with Luke Acts, so SPM we do Luke Acts, right? So the church preach Matthew, the movie makers make the Gospel of Luke, right? SPM do Luke Acts. Mark is always like kind of like a substandard gospel like that, right? Something like that. In more modern times, this position that Matthew was written first is proposed by the scholar Griesbach, two gospel hypothesis that Matthew wrote first, Luke relied on Matthew, and then Mark synthesized Matthew and Luke into one small one. So it's just slightly different. Still, Matthew wrote first, and then Mark is some kind of an abridging of existing material. So either abridge Matthew or abridge both Matthew and Luke. All right. So why? Number one, church tradition points to Matthean priority, like I said, because Augustine said so. Right. So there's been a long historical consensus that Matthew was written first. And when Matthew, Mark, and Luke have the same episodes, they don't all have the same episodes. When they all have the same episodes, there seems to be Matthew and Luke agrees against Mark. Not sure why that is a reason, but okay. And there's a lack of physical evidence of source documents. I'll talk about source documents at the end. So this is a traditional understanding that Matthew was written first. Surprise, surprise, my good friend Samuel Nissan holds to Matthean priority. I say, Samuel Nissan, you are the like 1% of biblical literate people who in scholarship who say Matthew was written first. Say, I know that, but why can't I be different? Yeah, you can be different, of course. So I'm not so different. I'm with most of scholars. I would say 99% of scholars would say that Mark was written first. We call this Markan priority. And here are some reasons. Number one, Matthew and Luke differ significantly, right? Matthew and Luke are so different. Yet 90% of Mark is found in one or the other. So the question is, did Mark abbreviate Matthew, Luke, or is it because Matthew and Luke use Mark independently? Right? Okay, there is the Gospel of Mark, and then Matthew copy some stuff from Luke, and then Luke copy other stuff from Mark, and then therefore there is that. So, and number two, if Mark was a redaction of either Matthew or Luke, why did Mark leave out important teachings of Jesus? If you were to do a summary of the Gospel of Matthew, right? So let's just say Augustine is right. Augustine is right that Mark was a summary of the Gospel of Matthew, a shorter version of the Gospel of Matthew. In what world will you do a summary of the Gospel of Matthew without talking about the Sermon on the Mount? I cannot imagine, all right, that you can do an abridgment of the Gospel of Matthew without alluding even to that Jesus was teaching on the mountain. Right? So it's either Mark is a copy. Mark is a recension, is a redaction of Matthew and leave out the Sermon on the Mount, or Mark wrote first and then Matthew added in the Sermon on the Mount, right? Which one makes more sense? And then in the triple tradition that we talk about, Matthew and Luke, yeah, they do agree against Mark, but they do not generally agree with each other when only one of them agree with Mark. Meaning to say somebody will agree with Mark. If Matthew doesn't agree with Mark, then Luke agrees with Mark. Okay. And the order events is the same thing. Wherever Matthew departs from Mark, Luke supports Mark. Wherever Luke departs from Mark, Matthew supports Mark. Somebody, either Matthew or Luke, will support Mark's order of events. In many places where Mark has rough Greek, Matthew and Luke smoothen over. huh? In many places where Mark has rough Greek, Matthew and Luke will smoothen over to make more cantik punya Greek. So Luke have always been said to be the most sophisticated Greek in the whole New Testament. Luke Acts and Hebrews are the most sophisticated Greek, and the one that is least like sophisticated in a sense will be Second Peter, and also the Gospel of Mark. For good reasons. So the Gospel of Mark is very rough. The Greek is not very well polished. So either Mark was written first an unpolished draft, okay, and then Matthew and Luke smoothens out the Greek, or Matthew wrote beautiful Greek, and then Mark, when you go and redact Matthew, you go mess up the language, right? Okay, and Matthew and Luke often disagree with difficult readings in Mark. For example, Mark 6 verse 5. Okay. Jesus said to them in Nazareth, a prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown and among his relatives and in his own household. He could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. This is the Gospel of Mark. Jesus couldn't do miracles because of their unbelief, right? It seems that Jesus' ability to do miracles is dependent on people's faith. But actually, I understand what Mark is saying. I was once preaching in the same church, three services, right? There was the 8:30 service, that was attended by 400 people. There is the 10:30 service, attended by 150 people. There is the 5 p.m. service, attended by 20 people, all in the same big hall that can fit 400 to 500 people, right? So the 8:30 one, I came out, 400 people, and then so I can do a lot of things, and then people, right? You know what I mean? Then the 10 o'clock one was okay because I was more refined because I should have said that, I should have said that, right? So I give my second one, it was okay. The 5 p.m., the 20 fellas who couldn't wake up in the morning to come to church, those 20 guys, right? They got bored up, they just sit there like very bored. So I also felt like no power, Huh? First of all, it's been a long day. Huh? No, not only that, like if I tell you, if the evening people were like all excited, I'll be excited also, right? After 8:30, 10 o'clock, then after lunch, with people talk some more, right? Talk some more. Then I went back to my office to wait until 5 o'clock, right? I just took a short nap, right? I wake up, right? Just like like and then preach then people not interested, right? Then you feel like, yeah. Okay. So maybe I think that was what's going on with Jesus. Not because he's not powerful. It's that their faith just makes him feel like, do for what? Huh? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Why not? Against their will. Yeah. Lazarus died. Whose faith it was that raised him from the dead? Yeah, Jonah. These are all faithless people that God give miracle. But of course, sometimes your faith has healed you. Sometimes your faith has healed you. That is correct. right? The guy who was at the Siloam pool, right, didn't even ask Jesus anything, right? It was Jesus who imposed himself on this decrepit guy. Huh? You read carefully again, you see his response. Okay, you see his interaction with, yeah. The last lah. Right. He wants to be healed, but he doesn't have any faith in that. But he didn't ask for it also. Yeah. Yeah. But here's in the practical world. Here. So Matthew goes with you. All right. Matthew says, and they took offense at him, but Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and in his own household. And he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. Oh, a big difference. He could not do versus he did not do. Huh? Big difference, right? No difference. He could not do is his ability to do miracle, all right, is dependent on the faith. If he couldn't, nothing happened. How come? Let's try again. Nothing. Yeah, you don't have faith. That's why. Don't want to do is this one. Did not do. Right? Since you have faith, I don't do. I don't want to do. Right? This one could not do is he wanted to do but cannot do. Okay, now, which one do you think was written first? Do you think that Mark was written first and he wrote in a very rough way? He could not do mighty works there. And then when Matthew was copying the part, you know what? I don't think I want to say that. Right? That's why he did not do many mighty works, because let's not confuse the people here theologically, right? Did that happen? Or Matthew wrote, he did not do mighty works there, and then when Mark was copying, he couldn't do mighty works. Which one do you think was more likely? Is my point. Mark was more likely, is my point. All right. Here, another difficult reading. Mark chapter 3, verse 4 to 5. He said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? The man with the withering hand, right? But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger. He was angry at these people for they were keeping silent, right? Grieved at the hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out and his hand was restored. Cool. Matthew goes, this Jesus' anger thing are problematic. So Matthew, right? Of how much value is a man than a sheep? Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? He didn't even want to talk about the silence. All right. He just said to the man, stretch out your hand, and the man stretched it out and it was restored. He sidestepped the whole thing of the look around at them and naked, grieve at their hardness of heart. All right. He sidestepped the entire thing. In the Gospel of Luke, and Jesus said to them, I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it? And after looking around at them, cancel out the word with anger and said to them, stretch out your hand, he did so, and his hand was restored. Again, which one do you think came first? Right? Yeah. So because of these, we would say that 99% of scholars would say that there's always Chris Buck, right? There's always a lone wolf, all right? The Lone Ranger, who says that Matthew was written first. So Markan priority. So this is called the two-source theory, that Mark was written first, and then Matthew copies from Mark, and then Luke copies from Mark, right? But then there are some sources, there's some things that Matthew and Luke have in common that is not in the Gospel of Mark. For example, the Lord's Prayer, right? The Lord's Prayer is in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, but not in the Gospel of Mark. How come both of them have this thing? So therefore, scholars postulate there is a source called Q that is not the Gospel of Mark. All right. There's another source out there That's not the Gospel of Mark, from which Matthew and Luke draw from as well. But then, what about things like there's only in the Gospel of Luke, right? Let's just say Jesus's childhood story from Jesus's childhood. Story from Jesus' childhood cannot be told by any other apostle. Can only be told by Mary, the mother of Jesus, right? She's the only source. And Luke did say, and Mary treasured up all these things in her heart. Meaning to say, Luke went to interview Mary, right, and get the story of Jesus 12 years old, these kind of things, right? The Magi came to, yeah, right, all of that. I'm getting my stories mixed up. Is that a story? Huh? Simeon, right? So Simeon, so it's Mary. So these stories are very tied to Mary, right? Mary brought Jesus, and then Simeon gave a nunc dimittis, gave a prophecy, and then after that, 12 years old, Jesus at the temple, and then Mary treasured all these things in her heart. So obviously, Luke has his own sources, and Matthew also has his own sources, and Matthew's source is probably eyewitness because he was there. Luke need to use sources because he wasn't there, right? So the most updated theory is this four source theory, okay, where Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark, all right, and then where Matthew and Luke has something in common that is not in Mark, we attribute that to Q, and then we say Matthew has his own M source and Luke has his own L source that includes Mary, the mother of Jesus. Okay, so this is the latest understanding of the sources. Then you ask, why does Matthew need to depend on Mark? Wasn't Matthew an eyewitness? Right? Because that is why there is a tradition, and I believe that is true, that Mark, after all, was Peter's secretary. You read Second Peter, right? Sorry, you read First Peter, Mark, my son, right? And Mark was Peter's secretary, his interpreter. And so he's been following Peter's ministry everywhere. And so he's been recording down things that Peter said. So the Gospel of Mark, Mark himself wasn't really an eyewitness, right? So the only reason why you would accept somebody, a second tier guy like Mark, the church, why would the church accept a second tier guy like Mark for gospel? What do you know, right? So it is because he followed Peter. This is actually Peter's testimony. So the reason for the rough Greek is because Peter had rough Greek. Like Second Peter. I said the two books that have rough Greek is Second Peter and Gospel of Mark. For the same reason, they came from this fisherman. So Mark was just faithfully copying down, transcribing Peter's sermons as he go from churches to preach. And so really the Gospel of Mark is the Gospel of Peter in a way. All right. And that is why Peter is so bad in the Gospel of Mark. Every time I read the Gospel, I always laugh at Peter. How come Peter so stupid one? Right? We always laugh at Peter, right? But actually, you think about it, what was Peter doing? Peter was a follower of John the Baptist. John the Baptist says that he must increase, I must decrease. So Peter made himself the butt of the joke, right? In order to magnify Christ. Because the next statement, the next line, the other apostles said the same thing. But he highlighted Peter said this, and then the other apostle said the same thing. It's because he wants to put himself down. That Peter is a great preacher. Too many preachers put themselves on lofty places, right? But he will put himself down to magnify Christ. That's the reason why it's accepted by the church. That is the reason why Matthew would copy from Mark, because it is his 大師兄, his 大师兄, his big brother Peter's story. You understand? So that is why Mark serves as the basis for both Matthew and Luke, because it is Peter's story. Okay? The end. The end. We started 9:45. So I end 11:45. Is that okay? All right. Yep. John has got many unique things, yes. Oh, no, it's not for what reason they are not in the other gospels. John was intentionally trying to write a different gospel because uh church tradition says, Papias, I believe, says that um they wanted John to write a gospel. Before John dies, his disciples wanted him to write a gospel. But John said there's already these three other gospels that are in circulation for decades. Right? Why? So he wanted to write a more spiritual gospel, um, according to the testimony of some church fathers. And so therefore he wrote it completely different. Things that are not covered by the other three gospels he wanted to cover lah. Mm. Jacob asked, there is portion of scripture which are not on early manuscripts. Are they not inspired by God? Like the trap that Pharisees had set on Jesus on the woman who was about to be stoned. Haha. So there is this one in John chapter what, 7, 8? John chapter 8, whereby there is this episode of this woman who was committed sin, and then they're brought to Jesus and say, uh the law of Moses demand that we stone such a woman to death. What do you say? And then Jesus was writing something on the ground, and then Jesus say, he who is without sin cast the first stone, and then they left from the oldest to the youngest, right? So this passage is dislocated. If you read the verse before this story and the verse after this story, actually sambung one. Okay. The verse before that story and the verse after that story in John chapter 8 actually is connected. This story is just intrudes itself in the middle of nowhere. And this particular story is not very John style. Okay. And sometimes this story in other manuscript is found in the Gospel of Luke. In other manuscripts, this story is found in the Gospel of Luke, not in the Gospel of John. And sometimes it's placed in different places in the Gospel of John in the manuscripts. All right. And then if you take away that story, then if you take away this story, then the narrative actually flows smoothly, which means that it wasn't originally there. Somewhat, it was a it was what is called a floating tradition. That means it is really a true saying of Jesus, or rather a true episode of Jesus, that came from the apostles, but was never adopted by either Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, but still was preserved. I would suspect that if there's ever such a thing as Q, all right, then John chapter 8 would have been in Q, whatever Q is. What is Q? Is Q a figment of scholarly imagination? Is it a variety of sources, written and oral? That's my position. A variety of sources, written and oral. A single written source, we don't have evidence of that. Evidence of heterodox community of Christianity that just go crazy. So I'm more of a variety. Q is a variety of sources, written and oral. Okay, so that's the Synoptic Gospels. We'll come back the next time for Mark and Luke X.